Hi all, I'm Professor Tina Good, and this video will be giving a brief discussion of the character of Paul and his influence on the New Testament. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a bit of a PowerPoint here to help us talk through Paul and as his historical character, as well as his contributions to the New Testament, and in so doing, his contributions to Christianity. Okay, so as I said, we can't really discuss the New Testament, even though the New Testament is largely known for the Gospels, and truly that is a major genre that comes through, but also um, are the letters that Paul creates, as well as there are some letters created by John, but Paul is a much more prolific writer when it comes to the New Testament. Okay, and so historically, what we can see is that Paul's letters, although they come after the Gospels in the New Testament, they were actually written about 2 decades or so before the first Gospel was written, known as Mark. They are the oldest surviving Christian documents. They believe perhaps that First Thessalonians is actually the oldest surviving Christian document. Um, he writes in letter form. That means that he is addressing these texts, these books, to a particular audience, right? And so we see the beginning of the letter form, right? Where you address your particular audience, and then you sort of how are you, that kind of stuff, and then you give the text of your letter, the content of your letter, and then you sign off, right? So this becomes a very, very popular form during this time. And Paul's contribution at minimum are 7 letters that you can find in the New Testament: Romans, First and Second Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, First Thessalonians, possibly also Second Thessalonians, and Philemon. Paul, although maybe not the primary author on these books, if he did not himself write them, his followers probably did. And so that would be Ephesians, Colossians, Titus, and First and Second Timothy. So you can see, right, that other than the Gospels, he is the major contributor to the New Testament. So what about Paul? Paul is an actual historical character. We can actually find his historicity and document that he actually was a person that walked on this earth and wrote these letters and did these contributions. And he is credited with largely turning this fledgling new religion known as Christianity into a world religion. Without his travels, without his missionary work, it probably would not have spread to become the religion that we know today. Um, so most of Paul's story is told in a similar way to the Gospels, right? So it's biographical, but it's biographical through these interesting lenses, right? In ways that we don't necessarily tell biographies today. Um, right. So we don't get his like birth story. We don't get any of that kind of stuff. But we can find, sort of his conversion story, if you will, in the book of Acts, which is believed to have been written by the same gospel writer as Luke. Um, and so while his complete story is there, historians don't really rely on the book of Acts to give us, historical accuracy. Instead, it's more of a literary tradition. But because of Paul's letters, historians are able to sort of, track his life once he started spreading his missionary work. Okay. Um, we know that he was a powerful Pharisee, right? You remember that the Pharisees were the Jewish leaders at the time of Christ, and they believed in the Torah, the laws of the Torah, that they should be followed, but also that there was an oral tradition. Unlike the Sadducees who said only the Torah. The Pharisees were a little bit more liberal in that they allowed for oral tradition to be a part of what should be followed in the Jewish faith. He was also known to be a persecutors of those who followed Jesus. His name, as it is told in Acts, was prior to his conversion. He was known as Saul of Taurus, and then, as the tradition goes, as we read in Acts, he had this revelation on the road to Damascus. It's a pretty famous image, the road to Damascus, where he has this revelation and he sees in this blinding vision, the risen Christ. And it is at that moment, according to the story, that he divests himself of all of his wealth and becomes not only a follower of the teachings of Jesus, but also a promulgator, that he is believed to be commissioned, by God to go out and spread the teachings of Jesus. And of course, he does that, but through his own interpretation and this idea of a religion. Okay. At first, he tries to convert his fellow Jews, but he is not successful at doing that. And so he risks being accused of blasphemy, and he begins to then commit himself to transforming Christianity to a religion for Gentiles. So he sort of gives up on the Jews. There's a lot of reasons for that. And he goes far away, right, away from Rome, to sort of escape persecution and also have perhaps better luck at his efforts of conversion. And in fact, he does. So he travels mostly through what was known as Macedonia in the 40s and 50s, and most famously goes to port cities of Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, possibly Ephesus, and more. All right. So this, if you were to see a map, you would see that this is really a widespread tour for somebody at this time to do. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the Queen of Sheba. Like, this is a serious trip for people at this time. Meanwhile, and I want to just keep us in historical context here, while he's doing this touring, Rome is beginning to persecute Jews, beginning to persecute Christians, and that world for those followers, right, is beginning to fall apart, and we are headed towards the ultimate destruction of the temple. Paul is now setting up, these Christian churches, right, in these other small towns, and they're struggling, right? So Paul goes in, sets them up, and then he goes away, and then he leaves them to figure out what to do, and they're struggling. They're struggling with their belief system, they're struggling with their governance system, they're struggling with their organization system, they're struggling with their hierarchy. You still have this idea of those who are wealthy should have special privileges over those who are not. And Paul is like, no, there should be like equality. This is a faith of equality. And so they're struggling with that. And so they would write Paul and say, like, we're having these struggles, and they would seek his guidance. And then he would write these letters back, right? And those letters make up much of the New Testament. But it's important to realize that when he's writing these letters, he is writing specifically to address the crises that are being, felt by that particular church in that particular moment, right? So there actually might even be some contradiction between the various letters, because he's writing to solve certain crises, right? And as he's doing that, he may be modifying what he has said in other letters. Eventually, of course, Paul is imprisoned. It's thought that perhaps in his imprisonment, he may have written quite a lot of these letters, and is eventually executed. So Paul's teachings. You can see this first one is really what gets him into trouble, with the Jewish leadership, and that is that he believed that faith in Christ superseded obedience to the Torah, right? So, it's fine to follow the laws of the Torah unless, right, the belief in the Christ teachings contradicted that, and then you needed to follow Christ's teachings, and that unlike what we saw in the Old Testament, that Paul believed that you received redemption through faith in Jesus. All right. And so this is different than what we saw in the Old Testament with the Deuteronomistic histories, right? The idea that, okay, if you do what God says, then you'll have economic and military success on earth, right? And if you don't, then you won't, right? But that was on earth. And what Paul begins to suggest is that you have to have faith in order to have redemption in the afterlife. And there was this also belief that with Jesus's appearance on earth, right, that this is bringing on the apocalypse, that his appearance and his death has begun the beginning of the end, all right, of time, and so he preaches with great urgency, right, that Christ is going to come again within his lifetime, that he is convinced that he will see the second coming, and therefore what is known as the final judgment. And those who have faith in Christ will, go up to, heaven, if you will, and sit next to God, while those who do not will be left on earth without redemption, right, and will be left to faiths, if you will, the wrath of God. He also conceived of Jesus as, this sort of dualistic form, and that the way that he existed, and that he had this macrocosm, what they call this macrocosm existence. This is very Greek, right? This very macrocosm existence where Jesus existed in the spiritual domain of the world, right? And so that he was everywhere, like this sort of omnipresence, much like God was conceived by this time. Um, and but he was also believed to by Paul through Paul's teachings to also had a microcosmic system, and that was that if you had faith in him, that he would reside within the human consciousness. And that he also believed, as opposed to sort of the Greek philosophers of the time, that the only way that you could, sort of, find divine wisdom, discover the mysteries, have wisdom, was not through rational inquiry, right? It wasn't through, you know, research and discussing with others and philosophy like Plato and whatnot. Um, but that you would have these revelations that would be given to you because, of your faith in Jesus. And you would have these revelations that would bring on, certain wisdom. And therefore, if Christ resides, not only up here in the macrocosm, but here within the body, and there was like this troubling dualism between body and soul at this time. But for Paul, the Christ resided within the human body, and therefore the human body had to be kept clean. Now, this is very, similar to the Torah, right? The body, needed to like only eat clean animals and have certain dietary restrictions. But you remember in the Old Testament, prostitution wasn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It was just another job. It wasn't looked on favorably necessarily, but it wasn't considered necessarily a sin. Now it is. It is, and much because of what's going on in Corinth, which I'll talk about in a moment. But having sex with prostitutes is now seen as unclean, even if you're an unmarried man, that this would be unclean and therefore not appropriate for the body. He viewed Christ to have three roles, right? All having to do with um, he was like a medium from God to humanity, and so through Christ, God's wisdom was revealed. All right. And that he himself was divine. Right. This was a big thing. This was another thing that was going to get him into trouble. That he was not just a man, but that he was a divine Lord, and that through him God ruled. Right. And that it was, through him that the Holy Spirit dwelled within the believers, right? So he was like this medium, spiritual and otherwise, through which humans connected to God. Now, I will admit that, as a woman, I do have some issues with Paul, right? And his teachings. He was, believed to have of his teachings, at least as configured in the letters that exist today, that women were secondary creations, right? And there's this idea like you remember back, one of the creation stories suggests that Adam was first and then Eve was second. Now this goes against, Paul's primary teachings, which was equality for all. So there's some speculation, scholars sometimes speculate that some of his letters were re-edited later on to perpetuate the patriarchy that was coming through the Christian religion, after Paul. But essentially in the letters as they exist today, women are to be subordinate to men. And he writes, such as God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of humanity, so too should man be the head of woman, right? And that women should keep silence in church. Now, there's some context to that, but that their role was not to question. Their role was not to, chatter. Women were sort of seen as, sort of gossipers, chatterers, and so Paul's just like, you know what? Just keep silent in church. Now, listen, again, these letters were meant to address certain crises. So it's possible that at one of the churches, right, women are causing a little bit of an uproar. They're chattering a little bit too much. They're gossiping. They're doing, they're not doing what they need to do. And so Paul says they should be silent in church. Maybe. Um, and that women should veil their heads. Now, in context, what he's saying is that when they are, prophesying, he did allow that women could have prophecies and whatnot, that they should veil their heads, right? And so, all of the consequences that come out of that. Um, we are talking specifically here about First Corinthians, but I want to take us back to a little bit about Corinth, and give us a little context for this idea of love that we're going to talk about in just a second. So Paul goes to Corinth, and Corinth was known to be a wealthy port city, and it was known to be a bit of a licentious city, right? It was a bit promiscuous and, a bit of hedonistic city. Not uncommon for other cities in Macedonia, but they had a particular cult of Aphrodite, known as the goddess of love. Okay, and also at this time, Paul's churches, including the ones in Corinth, are riddled with division, for those things, those reasons that I told you, and you can also imagine that a great deal of promiscuity is going on, but also there is a lot of pride, right? And so who's going to be boss? Who gets to tell who what to do? And so all of this is going on, and so they write, to Paul, like, how, the church is going to fall apart if they don't get guidance from Paul. Paul doesn't help them with their governance system. Paul doesn't help them codify some of their belief systems. And so he writes back to them. And perhaps one of the most, famous books, whether you have a Christian faith, or just a Christian background, um, is this First Corinthians 13. Shows up at a lot of weddings, and whatnot, and it is this sort of definition of love. Now, for Paul, this was not a romantic love, despite the fact that it now shows up in a lot of weddings. He's not talking about a romantic love. The Greek would have been agape, which meant selfless giving. Okay. And so that's the kind of love that Paul is talking about here. Can it be extrapolated to other kinds of love? Sure, why not? But that is the kind of love that he is talking about, and he is trying to tell the people who are causing all this trouble in the Corinthian church, right, that you have to exercise love. And this is what love looks like, right? And this is what it doesn't look like, right? And so essentially, he's telling the men, if you will, in Corinthians, knock it off, okay? You guys need to learn to get along, put your pride aside, and start giving to each other and build the church that way, based on this idea of love, right? And so he says, like, love is patient, love is kind, love rejoices in truth, right? And so if we think about that, right, the ideas of patience, kindness, truth, right? And truth, remember, would be revealed, right? Through wisdom and revelation. That we see a kinder, gentler church, right? Not one that is struggling to who's the boss, and who's going to control the money and who's, all that stuff. Like, calm it down. But what love is not, right, is not envious. It's not prideful. It's not arrogant. He really hits that. The pride is really something that is beginning to tear this church apart. It's not rude. It does not insist on its own way, right? No, it's about conversation. It's about coming together. It's about collaboration. It's about compromise, right? It's about, relying on, everybody's sort of kindness and patience, right, to move the church forward. It is not irritable. It is not resentful. It does not, begrudge, other people's successes. Does not rejoice in wrongdoing, right? And love never ends. So these are all great things, right, that we think about when we think about love. But when we look at this idea of love never ends, we have to start thinking about this metaphorically, right? Because if we look at those things, right, they're great, but they're not possible, right? They're not, I mean, it's possible from time to time, and it's possible to have that goal, but we're human, right? And we're going to be boastful, and we're going to be resentful, and we're going to insist on our ways sometimes. And whether that's in a marriage and romantic love, or if that's in the church trying to govern, right? The church, that's not, it's not always going to be possible. So we look at this idea of love never ends. We begin to get this idea of this sort of metaphorical, right? Of that omnipotence again, right? And what he's saying is you have to go back to Jesus, right? That divinity, right? That through that divinity, through that idea, we'll get revelation of these mysteries of how to move the church forward through love. That Jesus, right? Jesus, metaphorically, is love. Love is a mystery, right? How do we know love? It's a mystery that we can only find through revelation, according to Paul, right? So Paul's like setting it up, but he is not only leaving it to the mysteries, he is setting up behaviors that need to be followed, right? So there's this metaphorical idea of love, there's this idea of divinity of love, but then, right, there's these practicalities of love. right? Kind of reminds me a little bit of the Ten Commandments. Okay, here's what you have to do to have faith in God, but here's the practicalities of what you do. And then he ends with the sort of this triad that Christianity is supposed to be based on, this idea of faith, this idea of hope, this idea of love, right? And to have all those things, right? Those are mysteries that you get through faith, right? And believing through wisdom, through revelation. And the greatest is love. Okay. And so that's where we end our discussion of Paul. If we were to look at the other letters that Paul writes, or even more of First Corinthians, we would see a much more emotional Paul. We would see, sometimes an angry Paul. But, and even in this, we kind of could get this idea of like, knock it off, right? Stop tearing each other down and start building each other up, right? Which maybe is not such a bad thing to strive for, no matter what your faith system is. Okay, that love is at the core, right? So I hope you find this video useful, and have a great day.